The reception hall of Hartwell and Associates had a particular kind of silence that morning. The kind that comes not from emptiness, but from too many people pretending not to notice something. The man who had just walked through the front doors did not belong here. That was the first thing everyone thought and no one said. He was perhaps 60, maybe a few years past, worn canvas jacket, the sort that had seen too many winters to remember which one had faded it. Dark trousers, clean but not pressed. A paper coffee cup from the Tim Hortons 3 blocks east, still in his left hand. He carried nothing else. No briefcase, no portfolio, no lanyard, no badge. He stood just inside the entrance and looked around the atrium, the way a man looks at a landscape he has not visited in a long time, quietly, without hurry, as if cataloging what had changed and what had not. His name was Leonard Bowen. No one in that lobby knew that yet. The atrium of Hartwell and Associates occupied the bottom 4 floors of a tower on Bay Street, all polished limestone, and suspended glass panels that caught the morning light and broke it into long, pale strips across the floor. It had been designed, according to the firm's website, to embody clarity, ambition, and the enduring values of Canadian enterprise. The lobby staff had heard that phrase so many times it had become meaningless, the way all institutional language eventually does. What the atrium actually embodied on a Tuesday morning in late October was a gala preview for the firm's centennial anniversary. 100 years of corporate consulting. Rebranded for the occasion as a century of shaping Canada's future, the guests had begun arriving at 9. They were the kind of people who arrived with their names already printed on a list. Senior partners from Bay Street firms, a deputy minister or 2, 3 members of provincial cabinet who had cleared their schedules because the invitation had come from someone whose calls they returned. There were caterers in black, photographers with lanyards, assistants with earpieces, and a cluster of junior staff positioned near the entrance to manage the flow of arrivals with practiced efficiency. The woman managing the entrance was named Celeste Varga. She was 34, the firm's director of corporate events, and she was very good at her job. She could identify, within approximately 4 seconds, whether an arriving guest belonged in the main hall, the VIP lounge on the 2nd floor, or politely back on the pavement. This skill had been described in her performance review as exceptional situational awareness. Celeste preferred to think of it as reading the room before the room knew it was being read. She read Leonard Bowen in 3. Canvas jacket, paper cup, no escort, no name tag request at the door. Shoes that were clean but carried the particular scuff pattern of a man who walked long distances on concrete, not a man who was driven to them. She crossed the lobby in 11 steps. Good morning. Her voice was warm, professionally so, the warmth of a thermostat set to a specific temperature. Can I help you find something? Leonard looked at her. He had gray eyes, the kind that didn't harden when someone was dismissive but didn't soften either. They simply observed. I'm here for the 10:30, he said. Celeste smiled the smile she used when she needed a moment to think. Of course. And your name? Bowen. Leonard Bowen. She glanced at the tablet in her hand. Her finger moved down the list. She did not find it immediately, which meant, in her experience, one of 2 things. Either there had been an administrative error, or this man had arrived at the wrong building. She was weighing which explanation to offer when a second woman appeared at her shoulder. Patricia Hammond was the firm's senior vice president of client relations. She was 51, wore her authority the way some people wear jewelry, deliberately, and chosen to be noticed. She had overseen this event for 4 months. She knew the guest list the way a conductor knows a score. She looked at Leonard Bowen. She took in the jacket, the cup, the unpolished shoes. The service entrance, Patricia said pleasantly, is on Adelaide. If you're here with the catering team. The lobby did not go quiet. No one stopped what they were doing. But there is a particular quality of ambient attention, the kind where conversations continue but ears adjust, that settled over the nearest cluster of guests the moment Patricia Hammond spoke. A junior associate near the elevators turned just slightly. A photographer lowered his camera a half-inch. Leonard looked at Patricia. He looked at her the way he had looked at the atrium when he'd first walked in, quietly, without hurry. I appreciate that, he said. I'm not with catering, the guest list, Celeste began. Try the 2nd page, Leonard said. I'm told they put me under a holding company, BLN Capital. Celeste looked at the 2nd page. Her expression did not change, but something shifted behind it, a small recalibration, like a compass needle settling. BLN Capital was on the list. The notation beside it in the event coordinator's own handwriting read, Platinum Sponsors, Reserve Table, Main Hall, Second Row. Platinum sponsorship for the Centennial Gala began at $250,000. Celeste looked up. Mr. Bowen, I apologize for the confusion. She gestured toward the main hall. Please let me show you to your table. Patricia Hammond said nothing. She had spent 30 years learning when to speak and when to absorb the cost of a mistake in silence. This was a silence moment. She turned back toward the entrance and resumed her work with the precise steadiness of a woman who had already decided that what had just happened was a minor procedural irregularity, and not in any meaningful sense a reflection of her judgment. Leonard followed Celeste across the lobby. He did not look back. He finished his Tim Hortons coffee before they reached the hall. He had grown up in Sudbury. That was the detail Leonard had never quite managed to sand down into something smoother, despite 40 years of opportunity. Sudbury in the 70s was nickel dust and shift whistles, and the particular pride of people who built things with their hands because there was no other way things got built. His father had worked the smelter. His mother had kept the books for 3 different businesses on the same block, in a ledger she carried in a canvas bag, not entirely unlike the jacket Leonard still wore. He had studied engineering at Laurentian on a partial scholarship and a part-time job at a machine shop that started at 6 in the morning. He had graduated without ceremony, moved to Toronto with $1,100, and a recommendation letter from a professor who had written, in the final paragraph, Leonard Bowen is not the most naturally gifted student I have taught, but he is the most reliably correct one. Leonard had kept that letter. He thought it was the finest thing anyone had ever said about him. What followed was not a story of sudden success. It was a story of incremental, almost stubborn competence. A junior position at an infrastructure firm, then a senior one, then a partnership offer he turned down because he'd seen something in the numbers that his partners hadn't. A coming shift in northern resource development that would reshape where the real capital was going. He spent 8 years building a consulting firm that specialized in exactly that, watching the work become right, watching the money follow the rightness of it, and feeling, throughout, the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who was not surprised by the outcome, because he had done the arithmetic. By the time BLN Capital Incorporated, Leonard Bowen had more money than he had ever needed, and fewer reasons to discuss it than he'd ever had. He drove a 2009 Subaru Outback. He lived in a house in the annex that he'd bought in 1994 and renovated twice, both times himself. He ate lunch at the same diner on Bloor 3 times a week, where the owner called him Len and knew he took his coffee black. He had 1 daughter. Her name was Sophie, and she worked in development for a hospital foundation, a job she had chosen because she wanted to, in a way that had made Leonard quietly certain he had done something right. Sophie's husband was a school teacher in Etobicoke. They had 2 kids who called Leonard Grandpa Boots because of the rubber work boots he wore on the weekends. This was the man who had walked into the Hartwell and Associates Centennial Gala in a canvas jacket, carrying a Tim Hortons coffee, and been directed to the service entrance on Adelaide Street. He sat at the platinum table and read the program. The keynote address began at 11. It was delivered by the firm's current managing partner, a man named Bradley Strome who had joined Hartwell 22 years ago, and risen with the efficiency of someone who understood that visibility was its own form of currency. Bradley was 62 and had the build and confidence of a man who had been the smartest person in most rooms for so long that he'd stopped checking. He spoke well. The remarks were polished, the humor well-timed, the historical arc of the firm's 100 years presented with genuine pride and enough self-deprecation to feel honest. Leonard listened. He applauded in the appropriate places. He ate the smoked salmon appetizer with the focus of a man who was actually tasting it. Beside him, the table held 3 other guests, a retired judge named Alexander Fowler who had done work with BLN in the 90s, a woman named Odalis Chen who ran a development finance organization Leonard had funded twice without ever attaching his name to, and a younger man, late 30s, sharp suit, slightly too much product in his hair, who had introduced himself as Brendan Ash, Senior Associate, Corporate Strategy. Brendan had arrived late and spent the first 10 minutes checking his phone under the table. It was Brendan who spoke first when Bradley's remarks concluded and the room shifted into the pre-lunch social hour. So, Brendan said with the easy confidence of someone who assumed his questions were welcome. "What brings you to the event, Mr. Bowen?" Leonard said. "Bowen. Right." Brendan's eyes moved briefly across the canvas jacket. "Are you with one of the supplier firms?" Alexander Fowler made a small sound into his water glass. "No," Leonard said. "I'm with BLN Capital." "Right." Brendan nodded as if he recognized the name, which he did not. "And what does BLN focus on?" "Infrastructure, resource development. Some northern corridor work. Interesting." Brendan's interest was the professional kind, approximate and undirected. "Good space to be in right now. A lot of capital moving north." "It is," Leonard agreed. "It's been a good space for a while." Brendan nodded again and turned to check his phone. Odalis Chen caught Leonard's across the table. She had a very particular smile, small, precise, the smile of a woman who kept an accurate internal ledger. "I'd heard you were coming," she said quietly. "I didn't know if you'd actually show. Sophie said I should get out more." Odalis's smile widened by exactly 1 degree. "Sophie is right." Patricia Hammond found out who Leonard Bowen was at 12:17, in the manner of all information that arrives too late, efficiently and without mercy. Her assistant, a composed young man named Griffin, who had worked for her for 2 years and understood her very well, approached her during the lunch service with the tablet turned slightly away from nearby guests. "The BLN Capital confirmation," Griffin said, which was all he needed to say. Patricia looked at the screen. She read the file that Griffin had quietly assembled over the previous hour. The BLN Capital Portfolio Summary, the linked infrastructure projects, the historical giving record, the very brief biography that Leonard had never written himself but that enough journalists had assembled from public records. She read it the way you read something that requires you to stay very still. BLN Capital had, in the past 12 years, been the principal private investor in 3 Northern Ontario infrastructure projects that Hartwell and Associates had been retained to advise on. The firm's fees from those engagements totaled somewhere north of $18 million. Leonard Bowen had never attended a firm event. He had never asked for recognition. He communicated through a law firm in Ottawa and a financial advisor in Calgary, and, occasionally, through a short email from an address that contained no identifying information. He had registered for this event 3 months ago, under the holding company name, and paid the platinum sponsorship fee via wire transfer within 48 hours. No one had put a face to the name. Griffin was looking at the middle distance with the practiced neutrality of a man who understood that his job, in this specific moment, was to be furniture. Patricia handed the tablet back. She straightened. She had the look of a woman assembling, with great internal effort, a version of the morning that she could carry forward. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Bowen after the program," she said. "Of course," said Griffin. She crossed the room with the deliberate calm of someone who had made this walk before. Not toward an apology exactly, because Patricia Hammond did not use that word easily, but toward the kind of professional correction that could, if handled correctly, approximate one. Leonard was in conversation with Alexander Fowler when she arrived at the table. He saw her coming and said nothing. He waited. "Mr. Bowen?" Patricia extended her hand. "I'm Patricia Hammond, Senior Vice President of Client Relations. I want to ensure your experience this morning has been, that any inconvenience has been addressed." Leonard shook her hand. "Everything's been fine." "I want to be direct," Patricia said, which was something people said when they were about to be indirect. The confusion at the entrance was an administrative gap. "It won't happen again. I didn't expect it would." Patricia waited. In her experience, people in Leonard's position, people who had been dismissed and then discovered, usually required something more from the moment, an acknowledgement, a visible discomfort. She had learned to provide this graciously, on the theory that it was better given than extracted. Leonard appeared to require nothing. "I've been reading about the White Horse Corridor project," Patricia said, moving forward the way water moves around a rock. "The second phase. We'd be very interested in a conversation about Hartwell's potential involvement." "I know," Leonard said. "That's part of why I came today." Patricia blinked. "Once. There are 3 other firms I'm talking to," Leonard continued. "I wanted to see how Hartwell runs an event before I decided whether to have the conversation." The room was full of noise, silverware, conversation, a string quartet that had started near the east windows. Patricia was aware of all of it, and none of it. "And," she said. Leonard looked around the room. He looked at the limestone walls, the glass panels, the pale October light coming through the upper windows. He looked the way he had looked when he first walked in, as if he were reading something that took more than a glance. "The firm has good bones," he said. "I'll have my people call your people next week." He said it without irony, which somehow made it worse. Patricia said, "Wonderful. We'll look forward to that." She returned to her position near the entrance. She did not let herself think about the service entrance on Adelaide Street, about the canvas jacket, about the paper cup. She let it happen to her once, briefly, in the elevator later, when there was no one watching, a long, slow breath and the particular stillness of a woman absorbing the full weight of a morning's error. Then the elevator doors opened and she was professional again, which was, in its way, the only thing she knew how to be. The formal program ended at 2. Most guests stayed until 3, the way guests at successful events do, because something in the room still had warmth, and it was not yet time to return to offices and the ordinary calendar. Bradley Strome found Leonard near the windows on the east side of the hall looking out at the city. It was not a coincidence that Bradley found him there. Griffin, whose usefulness was difficult to overstate, had sent a quiet word. Bradley was not a small man in any sense, but he stood beside Leonard and felt, without entirely knowing why, that some recalibration was occurring. "Leonard Bowen," Bradley said. He extended his hand. "I'm glad you made it today. I should have introduced myself at the start." "You had a keynote to deliver," Leonard said. "You delivered it well, thank you." Bradley paused. He was a man accustomed to knowing the shape of a conversation before it arrived. This one was giving him less than usual. "I understand we may be talking about the White Horse project." "Next week," Leonard said. "My advisor will reach out. We'll make time." Bradley looked at him with the directness of a man who had decided that honest engagement was, in this case, the correct strategy. "I also want to say, I heard about this morning." "At the entrance, there was a mix-up," Leonard said. "There was," Bradley agreed, "and I imagine it wasn't the first time something like that has happened to you." Leonard looked at him, the gray eyes that observed without hardening. "No," he said. "It's not the first time." Bradley absorbed this. "I'm sorry for it." "I know you are," Leonard said. He said it without coldness, which was the interesting thing about him, the absence of the wound that most people would have carried, or at least displayed. There was no theater in Leonard Bowen. There was only the arithmetic, what had happened, what it meant, what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was a project worth considerably more than the pleasant morning it had very nearly been denied. 3 weeks later, the Hartwell and Associates team sat across a boardroom table in the offices of a law firm on Queen Street. Leonard was there with his advisor, a woman named Priscilla Okafor, who had worked with him for 11 years and had the permanent look of someone who knew where all the bodies were buried, because she had helped with the arithmetic that put them there. The Hartwell team was 7 people, Bradley at the head, Patricia 2 seats down, a senior infrastructure specialist named Gavin Chu, 2 associates, a finance director, and Celeste Varga, who had been included because she had the institutional memory of the event and because Bradley believed that people who made mistakes should be in the room when the correction was made. It was not unkind as policies went. Celeste sat very still. Leonard sat across from Bradley with a legal pad and a pen, and the 2009 Subaru Outback in the parking garage 9 floors below them, and 40 years of arithmetic in his head. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Bradley walked Leonard to the elevator. The rest of the team gathered papers, spoke in low voices, did the small things people do when a large thing has just been decided. "I want to ask you something," Bradley said when they were at the elevator, and the conversation had officially ended. "You didn't have to come to the gala yourself. You could have sent Priscilla. You could have had your law firm arrange a meeting directly." Leonard pressed the button. The elevator light came on. "I could have," he said. "So why did you?" Leonard thought about this. He thought about a diner on Bloor Street where they knew his order. He thought about grandpa boots and a house in the annex and a ledger in a canvas bag. He thought about what his mother had understood, that the real measure of a place was not what it looked like when everything was going correctly, but what it revealed when it thought no one who mattered was watching. "I wanted to see what kind of room it was," he said. The elevator doors opened. He stepped in, turned around, and met Bradley's eyes for a moment before the doors closed. He had seen what kind of room it was. He had decided it was worth building something in it anyway. Not because the room had earned that, not entirely, not without cost, but because Leonard Bowen was, in the end, the sort of man who built things, who looked at a place and saw not what it was that morning, but what it might become if someone did the work, ran the numbers, and stayed long enough to see the calculation prove itself out. The lobby was quiet when he passed through it on the way to the garage. Celeste was not at the entrance. The limestone floor caught the afternoon light and broke it into long, pale strips, the same way it had at 9 o'clock that morning, when a man in a canvas jacket had walked through the front doors with a paper coffee cup and the particular patience of someone who already knew how this day was going to end. He had just been waiting for everyone else to catch up.